September 8, 1941. The air over Leningrad still held a trace of summer, but it was a deceptive warmth, a lie. On that day, the last thread connecting the city to the rest of the Soviet Union was severed. An invisible yet deafening metallic snap echoed in the halls of power and in the kitchens of 3 million souls. The steel noose of Germany's Army Group North had been pulled tight. The siege had begun. For Hitler, Leningrad was no mere military objective. It was a symbol to be pulverized, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, the industrial heart of the North, the proud base of the Baltic Fleet. To conquer it was not enough. His directive was clear, stripped of all military euphemism. The city and its inhabitants were to be wiped from the face of the earth. Annihilation was official policy. The first act of this policy was not long in coming. The bombers of the Luftwaffe darkened the sky, ignoring the anti-aircraft batteries to concentrate on a single, devastating target. It was not the factories, nor the barracks, nor the bridges. It was the Badaev warehouses, the city's main food depot. Hell was unleashed on earth. For hours, the fire consumed thousands of tons of flour, grain, and sugar. A grotesquely sweet, burnt smell spread across the southern districts, a cloud of caramelized sugar mixed with the ash of hope. The citizens watched helplessly as a pillar of thick, black smoke rose into the sky, a shroud heralding the coming famine. The message was unmistakable. They would not be fighting soldiers. They would be fighting hunger. Winter arrived early that year, with a legendary ferocity. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. General Winter, Russia's old ally, now became a merciless jailer. Public transport ground to a halt, its cables frozen, its tracks buried under snow that no one had the strength to clear. Heating fuel ran out. In the grand apartments of Nevsky Prospect and in the humble communal dwellings, the cold seeped through the cracks, coating the walls with a layer of frost. People burned books, furniture, anything that would catch fire, in a futile attempt to ward off a cold that seemed to emanate from within their very bones. The daily deaths, at first counted in the hundreds, would soon be counted in the thousands. A soldier in his frozen trench, his fingers too numb to pull the trigger, felt the same emptiness in his stomach as a mother cradling a child who no longer cried. The city sank into an unnatural silence, broken only by the whistle of the wind, the distant thunder of German artillery, and the crunch of sleds carrying the bodies of the dead to common graves. The real enemy was no longer just on the outskirts. It was inside every apartment, in every empty stomach, in every breath that turned to a cloud of ice. Leningrad was about to discover the true meaning of the abyss. On the other side of the lines, at the headquarters of Army Group North, the atmosphere was not one of chaos and despair, but of cold, methodical confidence. The fall of Leningrad was considered an inevitable conclusion, a simple matter of time in the grand schedule of Operation Barbarossa. The strategic map on Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb's table showed a perfect red circle, drawn with a steady hand around the target. The order that had created that circle came not from a military strategy manual, but from the mind of Adolf Hitler himself. His directive of September 22nd was explicit, stripped of any pretense of honorable conquest. The Führer has decided to have the city of Petersburg wiped from the face of the earth. There was no interest in saving the lives of the civilian population. The city was to be shelled to its foundations and its inhabitants exterminated by starvation. Von Lieb, the executor of this plan, was a product of the old Prussian Guard, a disciplined and competent officer, a strategist who understood logistics and firepower. He was not an ideological fanatic in the SS mold, but he was a loyal servant of the Reich. He would carry out his orders with maximum efficiency, applying the principles of warfare to a task of mass annihilation. His approach reflected his character. Instead of launching a costly and bloody urban assault, street by street, against a city of $3 million, von Lieb opted for strangulation. He trusted that hunger and General Winter would do the work for him. It would be a scientific siege, an exercise in patience and relentless pressure. His army would not be a conqueror, but a jailer. The siege machinery was formidable. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers formed the Southern Ring. To the north, Finnish forces, reluctant allies in the so-called Continuation War, blocked any escape across the Karelian Isthmus. In the air, The Luftwaffe's first air fleet was tasked with terrorizing the population and destroying any resupply attempts. Arrogance permeated the German high command. The lightning victories in Poland and France had created an aura of invincibility. Soviet resistance, though fierce, was seen as the disorganized death throes of a corrupt and racially inferior regime. They believed that once the food supply was cut, the city's will would break within weeks. The reports reaching von Lieb's headquarters seemed to confirm this belief. The destruction of the Badaev warehouses was celebrated as a masterstroke that would accelerate the collapse. Every day, the siege guns, some of monstrous caliber, moved closer, preparing for the systematic bombardment that would turn the city into a field of rubble. The German planners calculated calories, grain reserves, the estimated morale of the population. To them, Leningrad was a mathematical problem that could have only one solution. They did not account for the human variable. They could not comprehend a type of resistance that was not measured in divisions or tanks, but in the quiet determination to survive. They underestimated the ability of an entire city to transform itself into a fortress. They underestimated the will of a people who, faced with annihilation, would choose to endure the unendurable. Von Lieb, in his methodical planning, had become the warden of the world's largest prison, unaware that his prisoners were forging a key from the only materials they had left: ice, defiance, and an iron will. The winter of 1941 became a monster that devoured the city from within. The bread ration, the only food for most, was cut to a 125-gram piece for civilians. It was a phantom bread, made of a little rye flour mixed with sawdust, cellulose, and the dust swept from bakery floors. People died silently, in their frozen apartments, in the bread lines, on the snow-covered streets. The city was facing extinction. The ultimatum did not arrive on paper signed by a German general. The ultimatum was dictated by reality. Either a solution was found, or Leningrad would become a tomb for millions. All eyes, desperate, turned to the east, towards the immense, frozen Lake Ladoga. It was the only gap in the German steel ring, a vast expanse of treacherous ice and polar winds. In the frigid halls of the Smolny Institute, the headquarters of the Defensie, the idea went from a whispered madness to the only tangible hope: to build a road over the ice, a proposal that defied military logic and the laws of physics. The more prudent generals pointed out the obvious risks. The ice could break. The Luftwaffe controlled the sky and would turn any convoy into an easy target. It was a suicide mission on an unprecedented scale, but necessity is the mother of audacity. Engineering teams were sent to the lake. Men wrapped in thick coats, their faces weathered by a burning cold, ventured into that white desolation. They drilled the ice, measured its thickness, calculated its load-bearing capacity, while the wind tried to tear the tools from their numb hands. The fate of Leningrad depended on their measurements. The conclusion was a terrifying gamble. The ice, in certain corridors, could support the weight of a light truck, but just barely. There was no margin for error. The decision was made in an atmosphere of grim determination. There was no other choice. On November 20th, 1941, the gamble was taken. Not with trucks, but with a convoy of horse-drawn sleds, an almost medieval image in the midst of an industrial war. The caravan moved slowly over the cracking ice, a dark, fragile thread in the white immensity. Every meter was a victory against fear, and it worked. The convoy reached the opposite shore and returned with a cargo of flour. It was a tiny amount, barely enough for a day, but its value was incalculable. It had proven that the impossible was possible. The road was born. They gave it a name that would resonate through history, a mixture of poetry and raw reality. Doroga Zhizny, the road of life. A lifeline had been forged in the heart of winter, but keeping it open would be a battle as fierce as any fought in the trenches. The story of the men and women who defied the ice and fire is what we will tell next. If courage in the face of annihilation is a story worth telling, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps these chronicles of resistance reach more people. Because what was about to happen on the frozen waters of Ladoga was not just logistics. It was the forging of a legend. The road of life was not a highway. It was an open wound on the frozen landscape, a scar that refused to heal. By day, it was a parade of Gaz AA trucks, affectionately nicknamed Polutorka, the 1.5-ton truck that became the workhorse of desperation. They moved slowly, spaced out to distribute their weight, with the cabin doors open, an unwritten rule. If the ice cracked in a particular way, the driver had mere seconds to jump before the freezing water swallowed his vehicle and its cargo. At night, the road transformed into a lunar landscape, lit only by the spectral glow of the northern lights or the sudden, brutal flash of Luftwaffe flares. The air raids were constant. German pilots, flying low over the ice, turned the convoy into a shooting gallery. The sound of sirens was useless in the vastness of the lake, replaced by the approaching drone of engines and the racing heart of every driver. A young female traffic controller, barely a teenager, stood at her post in the middle of a blizzard, a nearly frozen flashlight in her hand, guiding the trucks to the safest routes. She saw a flash in the sky and screamed at a driver to stop. Seconds later, a bomb exploded where his truck would have been, blasting a crater of black on steaming water. She saved his life, one of so many anonymous acts of heroism on that highway of ice. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was the nadir of suffering. The road of life operated at its limit, bringing a trickle of supplies and evacuating the weakest, children and the elderly. For every truck that reached Leningrad, another seemed to be lost to the bottom of the lake. The bed of Lake Ladoga became a cemetery of steel and bones, an invisible monument to the sacrifice of hundreds of drivers. When the thaw came in the spring of 1942, the battle for the road did not cease. It simply changed form. Ice gave way to open water, and trucks were replaced by barges and small boats. Now, the enemy was not only the Luftwaffe, but also German and Finnish patrol boats that lurked in the fog, and the summer storms that could raise waves capable of capsizing the overloaded vessels. In the midst of this daily struggle for physical survival, Leningrad prepared for an act of defiance that would transcend the war. Dmitri Shostakovich, one of Russia's greatest composers, had begun writing his 7th symphony in the besieged city amidst bombings and air raid sirens. The score was flown out of the city on microfilm, a cultural treasure transported as if it were a state secret. On August 9, 1942, as the siege continued its brutal monotony, the city decided to answer not with bullets, but with music. An orchestra was assembled from the surviving musicians. They were gaunt, weakened by hunger to the point they could barely hold their instruments. The conductor, Karl Eliasberg, had to stop rehearsals because the trumpeter didn't have enough air in his lungs to play. That night, in the grand hall of the Philharmonia, the symphony, which would come to be known as the Leningrad, was performed, but not just for the audience in the hall. The performance was broadcast over loudspeakers throughout the city and, crucially, towards the German lines. Before the concert, the commander of the Soviet artillery on the Leningrad front, General Govorov, ordered a special operation. For 1 hour, every available gun would bombard the enemy artillery positions, not for an advance, but to ensure silence. And so, as the orchestra of ghosts played Shostakovich's powerful music, an unnatural quiet fell over the front. The German soldiers in their trenches, accustomed to the din of war, listened in astonishment as an entire symphony rose from the city that was supposed to be dying. It was an act of psychological warfare of sublime genius, a message that said, "You can kill our bodies, but you will never destroy our spirit." The fight continued, relentless. Multiple offensives were launched to break the siege from the outside, all of them failing in bloody fighting in the swamps and forests east of the city. But Soviet determination was unbreakable. In January 1943, a new offensive, codenamed Operation Iskra, Spark, was launched. For 7 days of brutal combat, in extreme winter conditions, soldiers of the Leningrad front, attacking from the west, and the Volkhov front, from the east, fought their way through the fortified German defenses. On January 18th, near Workers' Settlement No. 1, the vanguards of both armies met. One soldier described the moment. There were no shouts of joy, just bearded, snow-covered men silently embracing, weeping. The blockade was broken. A land corridor had been opened, a passageway only 8 to 11 kilometers wide, but it was solid ground. It was within range of German artillery, and crossing it would be hell, but it was a land route, a real road. Hitler's strategy of starving the city had definitively failed. The spark had been lit. Leningrad would not die. The siege would continue, but its fate had been changed forever. The news of Operation Iskra spread like an electric shock on both sides of the front. For the defenders of Leningrad, it was the first tangible light of a dawn they had been awaiting for nearly 500 days. The opening of the land corridor, though precarious and constantly shelled, was a monumental psychological breach. The hunger would not disappear overnight, but the specter of annihilation by starvation had vanished. Immediately, engineers and railway workers launched into a race against time. Under constant German artillery fire, they built a railway line through the narrow corridor in just 17 days. They called it the Corridor of Death, but through it flowed life. The trains, moving slowly in the darkness, began bringing in supplies on a scale the road of life could never have achieved. For the German High Command, the failure to maintain the airtight blockade was a devastating blow. Von Lieb's strategy, based on methodical strangulation, had crumbled. The main objective, to wipe the city off the map without a costly battle of conquest, was now unattainable. The city had survived the worst. The failure was not just tactical, but ideological. The supposed Slavic inferiority had manifested as a resistance that defied German comprehension. Frustration gripped the German headquarters. Hitler, enraged, demanded that the corridor be cut at any cost. Fierce counterattacks were launched, but the Soviet defenses, now anchored to a supply line, held firm. The war in the northern sector transformed from a static siege into a brutal war of attrition. The domino effect of Leningrad's survival was felt across the entire Eastern Front. For 17 months, Army Group North had kept dozens of its best divisions, along with Finnish forces, pinned down around the city. These were troops that could have been decisive on other fronts. They could have reinforced the assault on Moscow in the critical winter of 1941. They could have been diverted south to tip the balance in the titanic Battle of Stalingrad. Leningrad's resistance not only saved the city, but also bled the German army in the north, preventing it from concentrating its strength at decisive breakthrough points. Every soldier defending Leningrad was, indirectly, also defending Moscow and Stalingrad. The city had become an anchor, a drain on the Wehrmacht's resources and manpower. The impact on morale was immense. The news of the Seventh Symphony had already spread around the world, turning Leningrad into a symbol of resistance against barbarism. The breaking of the blockade reinforced this image. For Soviet troops on other fronts, and for the partisans fighting in the rear, the story of Leningrad was a source of inspiration. If the city on the Neva could survive hell, so could they. For the German soldiers trapped in the forests and swamps of the north, the war had become a nightmare without end. The promised swift victory had turned into a frozen quagmire. The city that was supposed to fall in weeks still stood, defiant. The psychological break was not just Soviet, it was also German. The certainty of victory eroded with every train that reached Leningrad. With every day, the city refused to die. The land corridor of Operation Iskra marked the beginning of the end. But the end would be slow in coming. For another full year, Leningrad lived under siege. The city was still within range of German artillery, and the shelling continued to be a terrifying part of daily life. But the balance of the war had irrevocably shifted. The Red Army, strengthened and re-equipped, was preparing for the final offensive that would liberate its martyr city. In January 1944, nearly 2.5 years after the ring was closed, Soviet forces unleashed the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. It was a massive operation, a steel hammer that crashed against the weakened and demoralized lines of Army Group North. The troops who had defended the city for so long finally went on the attack, shattering the German defenses and driving west with a fury pent up for 872 days. On January 27, 1944, the complete end of the siege was officially announced. That night, the sky over Leningrad, which for so long had only been lit by fires and flares, was filled with a different kind of light. A 324-gun salute fired in celebration, its thundering reports echoing not as a threat, but as a hymn to survival. The citizens, weeping openly in the streets, watched the spectacle. They had won. The final statistics of the battle are almost impossible to comprehend. It is estimated that over 1,100,000 people died inside the besieged city. The overwhelming majority were not soldiers, but civilians, women, children, and the elderly who perished from hunger, cold, and disease. It is one of the most devastating losses of life suffered by a single city in human history. The road of life, that precarious line over ice and water, proved to be the difference between total annihilation and survival. Through that impossible route, nearly 1,300,000 people were evacuated, saving them from certain death. And through it came the food and ammunition that allowed the city to keep fighting. In the long run, the siege of Leningrad was burned into Russia's consciousness. It was the first city to receive the title of Hero City of the Soviet Union, an honor recognizing a suffering and resilience that defied all description. It became a pillar of the national memory, a sacred tale of sacrifice and victory against an absolute evil. The diary of Tanya Savicheva, an 11-year-old girl, was presented as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. In her small notebook, in a child's hand, she had recorded the death of her entire family. Her final, desolate entry read, "The Savichevs are all dead. Only Tanya is left." She too would die shortly after being evacuated, her body too weakened by malnutrition. Her diary became the voice of the hundreds of thousands of children who did not survive. The legacy of Leningrad is twofold. It is a grim testament to the Nazi regime's policy of extermination warfare, a reminder of the abyss into which humanity can descend. But it is also, and perhaps more importantly, an eternal monument to the indomitable power of the human spirit. The story of starving musicians playing a symphony under bombs, of lonely drivers crossing a frozen lake under fire, and of an entire city that chose to endure the unendurable rather than surrender, reminds us that even in the deepest darkness, the will to live and the determination to resist can forge a light that history will never forget.